Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 29, the Ward-Hopkins Controversy. Last time, we talked about the political history of Massachusetts from the 1710s to the 1750s. In particular, we focused on how the introduction of paper money in order to pay for the wars against Quebec led to periodic economic crises and a divide within the colony between opponents and supporters of increasing the money supply. Eventually, thanks to considerable pressure from the British government, the experiment in paper money was ended altogether. Today we're going to look at the political history of Rhode Island over roughly the same time period. Now let me give you a quick summary of the events we'll be talking about today, just so you'll know what to look out for. I'm covering a lot this episode and I don't want things to get too confusing. Okay, so a few years after the Dominion of New England fell, a man named Samuel Cranston became governor of Rhode Island. He served for almost 30 years straight until 1727. Needless to say, this was a time of considerable stability. But after his death, Rhode Island spent the 1730s divided over concerns about paper money, just like in Massachusetts. Then an alliance of two men, Richard Ward and William Greene, dominated politics for about 15 years. There were still some divisions, but mostly things were stable. But in the 1750s, a new political faction arose led by Stephen Hopkins. While the old faction was based out of the town of Newport, this new faction was based out of Providence, a rising town which wanted to dethrone Newport and become the leading city in the colony. These two groups battled it out for the next decade and a half, forming what were basically political parties, in what's known as the Ward-Hopkins Controversy. That'll be the main subject for this episode. Right, so that's the basics, let's dive in. Rhode Island, you'll recall, was founded by a bunch of outcasts from Massachusetts, religious and political dissidents like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who had been forced into exile one way or another. There hadn't originally been a single colony of Rhode Island, just a small number of towns scattered about. But eventually the towns were joined together into a single unit, which remained a haven for nonconformists, and was looked down upon by the Puritans and the rest of New England. But despite the derision of their neighbors, they managed to keep their independence, at least until the Dominion of New England anyway. But after the Dominion was overthrown, they emerged with their charter fully restored, like Connecticut. Both Rhode Island and Connecticut were still small and vulnerable, though. They were both rural and poor, with much smaller populations than Massachusetts, and in principle their charters could come under attack at any moment. So they both adopted a policy of appeasing England as much as possible, while strongly pushing back against any attempt to weaken their charters. So when the governor of Massachusetts was given instructions to take over Rhode Island's militia, the Rhode Islanders resisted strongly. But that didn't mean that Rhode Island was unwilling to help with the British war efforts. Quite the contrary. They wanted to keep the king happy, to show him that Rhode Island would be cooperative, so that there would be no need to raise challenges against their charter in the first place. This strategy proved pretty successful, in that they kept their charter. However, just like in the other New England colonies, there were still those in Rhode Island who were pushing for greater royal control, sometimes just out of a personal grievance against the government or something like that, rather than for any ideological reasons. In any case, one of the issues those royalists used to attack the current government was piracy and privateering. If you're not familiar with the term, privateering is when piracy is authorized by a state. So the English government could give pirates a license to illegally raid French shipping in times of war. That would be privateering. It was a common tactic back in the day. Well, Rhode Island had been intimately involved with pirates and privateers for a while now. Even more so than the other New England colonies, Rhode Island had a maritime focus. The main contribution to the wars against Quebec was authorizing privateers to plunder French vessels. The Royalists, however, said that Rhode Island had gone too far, that the colony had given pirates licenses to privateer under dubious pretexts, and even turned a blind eye to full-on piracy. And honestly, the accusations were probably somewhat true. After all, lots of other colonies were guilty of the same thing. Why would the colonies do something like that? Well, money mostly. Piracy could bring in a lot of cash, and that was extremely useful in a poor colony like Rhode Island. Without that cash, they would have had trouble paying for needed imports. So you can think of piracy as an alternative to the land bank or other schemes for printing money. And just like the land bank, piracy was strongly opposed by the English government. Anyway, the piracy issue indirectly led to the resignation of the governor, Walter Clark, in 1698. His replacement, Samuel Cranston, who happened to be his nephew, would go on to be elected as governor for the next 29 years straight, longer than any other governor of any colony or state in American history. Cranston had been a sea captain, and he was married to the granddaughter of Roger Williams, one of the founders of Rhode Island. He had also been kidnapped by pirates himself when he was a young man. Now that he was governor, Cranston came under immediate pressure from English officials to get his colony in order. He did what he could to placate them, taking stronger actions against pirates and so on. He also made sure that Rhode Island did its fair share for the war effort. So with Cranston in power, Rhode Island settled down into a long period of stable development. Its government became more centralized, the law code was rewritten, organized, and expanded, a process which took the better part of 2 decades given how confused and haphazard the legal system had been. The economy kept growing. Slaves were imported in considerable numbers by New England standards. Paper money was introduced in 1710, and industries like shipbuilding started to take off, which helped the colony become more of a trading center. A small economic elite formed, although they were less elite than the elite elsewhere. Massachusetts had done these things much earlier, but Rhode Island was a laggard thanks to its small size. Anyway, like the rest of New England, Rhode Island was finally becoming a normal member of the British Empire, as its cultural distinctiveness slowly eroded. They even started showing plays, although that was quite controversial. And as the economy grew, so did the population. From 1700 to 1750, the number of settlers in Rhode Island jumped from 7,000 to 36,000. A quarter of the population lived in towns, which was high for the time. Like in Massachusetts, this growth meant that the towns themselves changed. For instance, most of the common land was sold off or divided, so town governments became less concerned with land use per se, and more concerned with regulations and building roads, that kind of thing. Also, like in Massachusetts, the number of officials elected in each town shot up dramatically. Sidney v. James gives the example of Portsmouth, which in 1738 elected 52 officers, including, quote, 3 overseers of the poor, 3 assessors, 6 field drivers to capture stray livestock, a pound keeper, 3 viewers of hemp and flax, 2 corders of wood, 2 cullers of clapboards and shingles, a sealer of weights and measures, a sealer of leather, a packer, an auctioneer, a town attorney, and a committee of auditors, end quote. The town meetings were also more closely regulated by the General Assembly. Elections had to be held at certain times, the meetings had to be held 4 times a year, there were limits on which items could be put on the meeting's agenda, the requirements for what constituted a quorum were specified, and so on. And whereas before the towns had been free to choose who could move into their town, the General Assembly now mandated that they had to allow in anyone, as long as they owned 50 pounds worth of land within the town's borders. So just like in Massachusetts, the era of the independent town was already ending, thanks to the growth and economic changes within New England. The growing population also meant that it was time for Rhode Island to finally split its legislature into an upper and lower house. That happened in 1696. Both the upper and lower house were elected. Connecticut also made its legislature bicameral in 1698. That meant that all of the colonies now had bicameral assemblies, although Pennsylvania wound up switching back to a unicameral assembly later. And the legislature became more professional over time as well, as delegates accumulated experience in governing. Rhode Island remained religiously pluralistic. There were no town churches like in the rest of New England, and there was no formal religious discipline. No way to force people into conformity. Nor were there many trained ministers in the colony, for that matter. The result of this freedom was a rapid shift away from anything resembling traditional Puritanism. All sorts of heresies flourished, and Quaker missionaries had considerable success in converting the settlers. In fact, the Quakers had such success in organization that they rather dominated the government by the late 1600s. The other main religious group was the Baptists. Baptists in this case meaning those who rejected infant baptism while accepting adult baptism. That's a common belief among many Protestant groups today, but at the time it was very controversial. These Baptists were the sort to take the Bible very literally, and they tended to have regular schisms over biblical interpretation, even over minor issues like whether the Sabbath should be on Saturday or Sunday. This was a preview of America's religious future, different denominations endlessly fracturing and struggling with each other to gain converts. I guess it's not surprising that this would happen in the first colony to really embrace tolerance. One way in which Rhode Island was surprisingly modern, despite its late start. So that's what Rhode Island was like under Governor Cranston. I don't think there's any need to get into the elections during that period. The same man remained governor for 3 decades after all, so it's not like there were any big turnovers of power. There were no big issues to contest, and in general people were happy to see Rhode Island slowly develop. Or if there were big issues, they were kept in check for the time being. But Cranston died in 1727. After his death, it didn't take long for Rhode Island to become divided by factions, at least a little bit. One of the main divisions was over the currency. For instance, in 1732, the hard-money governor lost re-election thanks to voters who wanted looser money and more inflation. But that initial burst of factionalism had died down by the end of the 1730s. The 1740s saw the ascendance of the Ward-Green alliance based out of Newport. It was led by Richard Ward and William Green, who together controlled the governorship for 13 of the next 15 years. It seemed like Rhode Island might be returning to normal after the moderate strife of the last decade, but alas, the 1740s were also the decade of King George's War, the next big war with Quebec. The war caused fiscal problems for Rhode Island just like in Massachusetts. The government tried to stay on top of its debts, but the Treasury and the courts were both inefficient and overworked. The government simply didn't have the administrative capacity to handle it, nor did it have the money to pay its debts without further depreciating its currency. These money problems led to unhappiness in the colony, which led to another burst of factionalism. Presumably Rhode Island was divided along familiar lines, with rural farmers versus urban merchants and so on. In 1745, in the middle of the war, the current governor, William Green, was thrown out of office and replaced by one of his opponents, a Quaker with the excellent name of Gideon Wanton. Wanton was a proponent of paper money. Not only that, there was massive turnover in both the upper and lower houses of the General Assembly as well. However, the year after that, things were reversed, and former Governor Green managed to take back his office, before losing to Wanton again the next year, only to win again the year after that. So there was some back and forth, but this was a brief war, which only lasted 4 years, and it didn't take long for politics to calm back down. The Ward-Green faction returned to its position of dominance, and the factionalism over paper money evaporated as the immediate crisis ended. So with the end of the war, had things finally calmed down for real this time? No, of course not. There's always another fight just around the corner. Paper money wasn't an issue at the moment, so what was the issue? Well, now the issue was a growing rivalry between the two largest cities in Rhode Island, Providence and Newport. Newport, which was on the coast, was the largest city and the most important port in the colony. Actually, it wasn't just important by Rhode Island standards. Newport had become one of the 5 largest ports in the colonies, and it became a center of economic activity in general. Naturally, the city was politically dominant as well. The Ward-Green faction was from Newport. Providence, on the other hand, was further inland up the Narragansett Bay, which actually made it a better spot for a port. However, Providence had gotten a later start than Newport, and so it remained smaller and less important. That was slowly starting to change. Thanks to its superior location, Providence slowly gained ground relative to Newport, and by the 1750s Providence was strong enough to challenge Newport both economically and politically. If you're familiar with ancient Greek history, this may remind you just a bit of the rivalry between Athens and Sparta, which led to the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC. According to the Greek historian Thucydides, quote, "What made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power, and the fear which this caused in Sparta." End quote. While I wouldn't take the analogy too far, no one in colonial America was particularly Spartan, but the basic setup is similar. 2 cities, one rising relative to the other, and only one of them can reign supreme. It's a natural recipe for conflict. Partly it was a question of patronage. Who would get government jobs? Who would be given approval to become a privateer in times of war? In which city would the new college get built? Who would get the money to improve infrastructure or build schools? Who would gain from new taxes and who would lose? Who would be granted a monopoly in a given industry? There was a lot riding on such questions, and sometimes only one group would come out on top. But mainly it was that the merchants of Providence would make more money the faster Providence grew, while the merchants of Newport would lose money if their city were eclipsed. Not only that, the farmers living near Providence would make more money the faster Providence grew, and vice versa for the farmers living near Newport. So this wasn't just a fight between 2 groups of merchants. The whole colony had a stake in the rivalry. Farmers and merchants from the north joined together, as did farmers and merchants from the south, although both factions were led by men from the merchant class, not farmers. The Ward-Green faction, which was based out of Newport, had been running Rhode Island for the last 15 years. They were still in power, but Richard Ward had been replaced by his son, Samuel Ward. Samuel Ward was in his 30s, likable and smart, and generally a good politician. He had already served a few terms as a deputy in the legislature. In Providence, however, a new faction was forming around Stephen Hopkins. Hopkins was from rural Rhode Island, but he had moved to Providence to better himself. 18 years older than Ward, Hopkins was also smart and well-read. He had risen up through the political ranks, for a time serving as a member of the colony's Supreme Court. By the early 1750s, Hopkins and his group were about ready to take power. William Green was still serving as governor as he had for most of the last decade. I should mention that in 1754 a new war with Quebec broke out, just 6 years after the last one had ended. This conflict was known as the 7 Years' War, or as the French and Indian War in America. I'm not going to talk about the details of the war just yet, I'll save that for later. For now, the important thing to know is that the English were finally successful in conquering Quebec, and that they managed to force the French off the continent altogether. But the important thing to know for Rhode Island is that the government once again started piling up debt. So not only was there a rivalry between Providence and Newport, there were disagreements about money as well. Anyway, in 1755, the year after the war started, Stephen Hopkins won the governorship, narrowly defeating Governor Greene. Hopkins won re-election the next year, but his second re-election campaign against Greene didn't go so well. Samuel Ward, the son of Richard Ward, was naturally backing Greene against Hopkins. Ward wrote a pamphlet accusing Hopkins of corruption and arrogance. Hopkins was outraged and he sued Ward for libel, demanding a ridiculous £20,000 in damages. However, he not only lost the court case, he lost the election. Greene was back in office yet again, thanks to Hopkins' overreaction. But Greene died after less than a year in office. The Assembly chose Hopkins to replace him for the rest of the term, so he was right back where he was before. With Greene dead, the young, 43-year-old, Samuel Ward was left in charge of the Ward-Greene faction, which was really just the Ward faction at this point. But now the stage was set for much bigger escalation between the two factions. So far, the fight between the two had been pretty tame. They were just doing politics in the normal New England way, which is to say it was very low-key and disorganized. But with the personal rivalry of Ward and Hopkins, plus the regional rivalry between Newport and Providence becoming more and more acute, both sides began to organize. Both Ward and Hopkins created what were essentially political parties in order to fight the other. All of a sudden, Rhode Island politics took on a completely different character, as both factions rapidly figured out how to compete in a democracy. Much of this was carried out by people with a direct stake in the elections, men who stood to win big should their faction win. That was the driving force behind polarization, patronage. They handpicked candidates to run for office. They literally carried the elderly and the sick to the polls in order to vote. In the words of Sidney V. James, quote, "The opposing parties waged their campaigns with vigor and cash to pile up the vital majorities in elections. Candidates and their backers made speeches, printed broadside appeals, and inspired useful items in the newspapers. The Hopkins side helped launch the Providence Gazette to gain an outlet for its views. The political managers treated voters with food and drink. They hired men, either to earn their gratitude when the ballots were cast, or to keep them busy when the voting was in progress. They rigged spurious land transactions to get poor men admitted to the suffrage. They paid the undecided to vote for their own slate, and paid the dedicated opponents not to vote at all." End quote. The factions also provided their own pre-printed ballots. Now, normally in New England at this time, ballots were just blank slips of paper. You would write the names of the candidates you supported on it and then hand it over to be counted. There were no pre-printed ballots with all the candidates listed, as today. That made voting more inconvenient, and it also provided an opportunity for the factions to compete. Each faction would print out their own ballots with only their own candidates listed. So the Hopkins ballot would have Hopkins and his men on it, but not Ward or Ward's men. That made it much easier for voters to just support one side or the other. You could simply hand a pre-printed ballot in without having to write anything down. You didn't have to do that, of course, but you could, and it was oh so much easier. Naturally, many voters wound up voting entirely for one faction or the other. Some 2/3 of voters consistently sided with one faction or the other over the course of the Ward-Hopkins controversy. In some towns, almost no one changed their votes year to year. That was unusual behavior for the time. Back then, people often changed their votes with each election, rarely supporting the same set of candidates. But not only did the parties print out their own ballots, they even went so far as to print deceptive ballots. For instance, the Hopkins faction might print out a ballot with Ward at the top of it, but Hopkins men for all the other offices, and then distribute that ballot in areas which supported the Ward faction, in the hope that supporters of Ward would just notice the name Ward at the top and assume that the rest of the ballot was full of Ward faction men without bothering to check. Then they would hand in their ballot not knowing they were mostly voting for Hopkins men. So we're talking some pretty sophisticated trickery here. It didn't take the Rhode Islanders very long at all to figure out how to work the system, once enough of them were determined to do so. And many of these same practices, such as each party printing out its own ballots, would become standard practice in America for like a century to come. So in Rhode Island here, we're definitely seeing a preview of American democracy after independence. It wasn't necessarily the case that future generations were copying from Rhode Island, but the pressures of mass democracy were very similar. There were only so many ways to get people to vote after all. And these methods did prove pretty effective. Before the start of the controversy, turnout had been in the standard 25% range, but during the controversy, turnout for the gubernatorial elections remained above 40% for a full decade. And after the controversy ended, turnout dropped to under 20%. So clearly a lot more people were voting. Not incredible numbers, but consistent. Other contests elsewhere in New England had higher turnouts, but only once in a while. Maybe the fact that there were no grand principles at stake hurt. After all, the Ward-Hopkins feud was pretty unexciting if you didn't have an economic stake in the outcome. I don't think you could say that the whole colony was gripped by election fever. Anyway, all of the elections were close. Neither Hopkins nor Ward ever got more than 55% of the vote. And remember, there were only like 3,000 or 4,000 voters in a given election, so a narrow margin of victory meant that the winner won by hundreds, if not mere dozens of votes. In 2 separate elections, Hopkins won by just 66 votes. In another election, he won by just 24 votes. Unsurprisingly, the main divide was geographic. 2/3 of voters in the North supported Hopkins and 2/3 in the South supported Ward. Not exactly unanimous, but still striking. Voters in the middle of the colony could go either way, and that was where both factions directed much of their efforts. Neither wealth nor occupation mattered much. Artisans and farmers and wealthy merchants all tended to vote the same way, depending on location. So it really does seem to have been a regional struggle above all else, even though there were sometimes other issues at play. Now, the struggle between Ward and Hopkins took over a decade, with the votes held each year, so I'm not going to get into the specifics of every election. In any case, the specifics aren't as important as the broader picture, in terms of helping us understand elections in America. Power went back and forth between the two factions, although Hopkins usually came out on top. He was elected for 9 out of 13 years, and Providence got as much patronage as he could throw at it. For example, while the colony was at war, Governor Hopkins made sure that it was men from Providence who got permission to become privateers. And he also made sure that the colony's new college, which would later become Brown University, was established in Providence and not Newport. His faction even blocked an attempt by the Ward faction to set up a second college in Newport. There were still other issues beyond mere patronage, though, most especially the currency, of course, and related debates over taxation. The Ward faction didn't really have a plan to deal with the currency, apparently. They were split between 2 groups of their supporters, the merchant elite of Newport and rural farmers, each of whom had seriously divergent economic interests. Like with any other party in a 2-party system, the Ward faction wasn't a coherent thing. It was composed of different, smaller groups who only shared some interests. So it was difficult to come up with a plan that would win the approval of all or even most of their supporters. The Hopkins faction, on the other hand, despite similar difficulties, did manage to come up with a plan, which would standardize all of the old currencies floating around into a single currency backed by silver. And that's what happened. During one of the times while it was in power, the Hopkins faction managed to get this plan passed into law. The problem with this plan, however, was that the government had to buy enough silver to back the new currency, which was expensive, which meant that taxes would have to go up, which raised its own set of issues. What should be taxed, or rather who should be taxed? Both factions cooperated to come up with a bipartisan plan, but the supposedly bipartisan plan actually placed heavier burdens on Newport than on Providence. So a few years later, when the Ward faction was in total control of the government, they repealed the old plan and passed a new one, which heavily favored their constituency in the South. But apparently Ward didn't do a great job while in office. He managed to alienate some of his own supporters, and so he lost his second bid for re-election in 1767. Hopkins was back in power, and he reversed Ward's new tax plan, going back to the previous bipartisan agreement. As it turned out, that was pretty much the end of the Ward-Hopkins controversy. Hopkins was able to pass most of his desired legislation, and Ward was no longer able to compete. Basically, Hopkins won, partly just because he was a somewhat better politician. And in the end, Providence completely eclipsed Newport. Today, Providence is both the capital and the largest city in Rhode Island, while Newport is a small town with only some 24,000 residents. So that's the end of the Ward-Hopkins controversy. Probably both Ward and Hopkins were happy to see it end. Actually, both of them had been quite displeased with the factionalism that was being carried out in their names. The political norms of the day said that factions and parties were a bad thing, that parties were just the result of men abusing the government for their personal gain. So both men felt like they had inadvertently created a monster. Neither of them had wanted to be in that position, but neither of them saw a good way to back down either. The logic of party had a life of its own, as the founding fathers would discover a generation later. But really, this was a minor dispute. It pushed Rhode Island into a state of anxiety, but it left no lasting scars. Once these factions went away, they went away for good. You may have noticed that the end of the Ward-Hopkins controversy came only a decade before the War of Independence. The minor dispute between two minor cities was fast eclipsed by much bigger issues. And as it turned out, almost everyone in the colony wound up supporting independence, regardless of which faction they belonged to. They may have clashed over local issues, but ultimately they had similar economic and political interests, and so they responded to British provocations in the same way. The fights of the past were soon forgotten. In fact, both Hopkins and Ward were delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774. But although neither of these factions survived, many of the techniques they pioneered would live on in the fierce electioneering of the early American Republic. No more the stately, patrician-led quasi-oligarchy of the past. Well, the stateliness was gone at any rate, replaced with lively mass appeals to the public, and with the offer of patronage for supporters. That style of politics won't take hold in the rest of the United States for decades to come, but Rhode Island gives us a sneak peek of what it'll be like. The old model of a fairly closed elite making decisions on its own with relatively little public input was dying. It makes sense that it would die first in Rhode Island, the most populous of the New England colonies. All it took was a spark to set things off. Okay, so last episode we saw factions in Massachusetts arise because of disputes over paper money. This episode we saw factions in Rhode Island arise because of a rivalry between two towns for dominance. Next episode we'll see factions in Connecticut arise because of a religious divide within the colony, over the first big American revival movement, the Great Awakening. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.